There is a quiet moment in the awakening journey that very few people are able to describe clearly. It does not arrive in a dramatic way. There are no fireworks inside your mind, no grand revelation that instantly changes everything. In fact, it begins almost imperceptibly. A small space appears, a pause, a brief moment in which you notice something incredibly simple, yet deeply unsettling. A thought appears in your mind. Maybe it is an ordinary thought, something like, I need to fix this, or perhaps, why does this always happen to me? But this time something feels different, because for the first time, you do not feel like you are that thought. Instead, you notice something curious. You notice that you are observing the thought, and that small shift changes everything. Until that moment in your life, something inside you always assumed one thing to be absolutely true, that you were your mind, that you were your ideas, that you were your worries, that you were your memories. But in that instant, a new possibility begins to appear. If you can observe your thoughts, then who exactly is the one observing them? At first, this question may seem simple, but it is one of the deepest questions a human being can ask. Because for most of our lives, our identity is built around the mind. We believe we are the story it tells, the narratives it repeats, the interpretations it constantly produces about reality. But what happens when you begin to see that the mind is simply a process? Something that happens within awareness, something that appears and disappears, something that constantly changes. At this stage of the journey, many people begin to notice something strange. Thoughts continue to arise, but the relationship with them begins to shift. Before, every thought felt like truth. Now they begin to feel like mental events. And when this starts happening, a new experience begins to emerge, an experience of space between you and the mind. This space is subtle. At first it may appear only for a few seconds, maybe during a moment of silence, maybe while watching your breath, or perhaps while noticing a thought drifting by like a cloud in the sky. But even though it is brief, it reveals something important. It reveals that there is a dimension of your experience that exists before thought, a silent presence, an awareness that observes. And as this perception deepens, a new question begins to arise naturally. If I can observe my mind, am I truly it? This question can initiate one of the most profound transformations a human being can experience, because slowly, something inside begins to reorganize. Identity begins to shift. Instead of being completely fused with the mind, it starts moving toward the observer. But there is something important that very few people talk about. This shift does not happen instantly. It unfolds in cycles. Moments of clarity, followed by moments in which the mind takes over again. Moments of presence, followed by moments of identification. And this can feel confusing, almost as if two different realities are coexisting within you. On one side, the mind continues to function exactly as it always has, thinking, planning, interpreting, reacting. But on the other side, a new dimension slowly begins to appear, a dimension of observation, a dimension of awareness, a dimension that sees thoughts without necessarily becoming them. And as this change unfolds, the way you experience life begins to shift. Situations that once triggered automatic reactions begin to look different. Thoughts that once seemed absolutely real begin to lose their grip. And gradually, something unexpected begins to emerge. A sense of inner freedom. But this freedom does not come because thoughts disappear. They continue to arise. The difference is that now there is enough space to notice something fundamental. You are not what the mind says you are. And as this understanding begins to mature, a new way of living becomes possible, a way of living from awareness, instead of living from the mind. But this leads to a deeper question. If you are not your mind, then who are you? And that question marks the beginning of a new stage of the journey. A journey that is not about controlling the mind, but about understanding the nature of consciousness itself. And that is exactly what we will begin exploring next. Once this small separation begins to appear between you and your thoughts, something very interesting begins to unfold. At first, this shift is almost imperceptible. It feels like a brief pause inside the mind. Perhaps you are in the middle of a thought, and suddenly you notice, wait, this is just a thought. For a few seconds there is space, a kind of silence, a subtle distance between you and what is happening in the mind. But then another thought appears, and before you realize it, you are back inside the story again, inside the narrative, inside the emotional reaction created by that thought. This happens because for most of your life, the mind has been the center of your identity. It interpreted everything. It gave meaning to every experience. It created conclusions about who you are, who others are, and how the world works. The mind built an entire map of reality, and that map became so familiar that you began to believe it was reality itself. But when awareness begins to awaken, something starts to change in this relationship. For the first time, you begin to notice that there is a difference between the thought and the awareness that notices the thought. This is an extremely important moment in the inner journey, because it reveals something that has been hidden for a very long time. You were never the mind. But here's something interesting happens. When this realization begins to appear, the mind often reacts, and it reacts in very intelligent ways. It may begin creating new thoughts, trying to explain the experience. It might say something like, "Now I understand everything," or perhaps, "Now I need to maintain this state." But look closely. These thoughts are also part of the same movement of the mind trying to capture something that exists beyond it. This is why many people become trapped in a new subtle illusion at this stage. They turn awakening into another concept, another identity, another mental story. But the real shift does not happen at the level of ideas. It happens at the level of perception. You begin to see that thoughts simply appear, they arise spontaneously. A thought may be a memory, a worry, an interpretation, a judgment, but it arises and then it disappears. If you observe carefully, you will notice something extremely revealing. You do not choose your next thought, it simply appears in the mind. And this raises a profound question. If you do not choose the thoughts that arise, how could they truly define who you are? This question begins to weaken a very old identification. The belief that you are the voice inside your head. Because when you observe closely, you notice that this voice is constantly changing. One moment it is confident, the next moment it is insecure. One moment it is calm, the next moment it is anxious. The voice of the mind is always shifting, but something remains constant. Something is present observing all these changes. This silent presence is something the mind cannot fully grasp, because it is not a thought. It is that which notices thoughts, and as this realization deepens, something very interesting begins to happen in your daily experience. Thoughts still appear, but they start losing some of their power. Before, every thought seemed like a command, like an absolute truth. Now they begin to be seen simply as movements of the mind, patterns appearing and disappearing. It is like watching clouds moving across the sky. The clouds continue moving, but the sky remains. Thoughts continue appearing, but awareness remains. And as this perception matures, you begin to notice something remarkable. There is a space between thoughts, a silent space, a space where no narrative is happening, a space where there is no problem to solve. This space has always been here, but before, it went unnoticed. Because attention was completely absorbed in the content of the mind. Now slowly, this space becomes more visible, and with it emerges a new quality of experience, a sense of presence, a sense of being here before any thought appears. And as this presence stabilizes, many things begin to change in the way you live. Automatic reactions begin to soften, the need to control everything begins to relax, and something far more natural begins to emerge. Clarity. But here is something very important that many people misunderstand. This transformation does not happen overnight. It unfolds gradually. It is as if an old identity is slowly dissolving. For years you believed you were your thoughts. Now that belief begins to lose its strength. But this can also create a strange moment in the journey. Because when you stop identifying completely with the mind, a new question naturally appears. If I am not my thoughts, then who am I? This question cannot be answered merely with words. It must be explored directly in experience. And that exploration begins to open the door to a much deeper understanding of consciousness, an understanding that goes far beyond the mind. And in the next part of this journey, we will explore something even more fundamental, something that completely transforms the way you perceive your own existence. There is a very specific moment in the inner journey when something begins to become clear, but not yet fully understood. It is like seeing light through a mist. You start noticing that you are not your thoughts. But at the same time, thoughts continue appearing, and this can create a quiet confusion within your experience. Because for many years, perhaps your entire life, the mind seemed to be the only place where you existed. All decisions, all interpretations, all stories about who you are, everything appeared to happen inside the mind. So when this identification begins to weaken, a new space begins to appear. A space of observation. You notice a thought arising, and instead of reacting immediately, you simply observe it. Maybe for a brief moment you see the thought as something separate from you. And in that moment, something very important happens. You realize that there is a presence watching all of this. A presence that is not the thought. A presence that is not the emotional reaction. A presence that simply notices. At first, this awareness can be extremely subtle. so subtle that many people do not even recognize that it is already happening. But if you observe carefully, you will see that there is always something within you that is aware of the experience. If a thought appears, you know it appeared. If an emotion arises, you know it is there. If the body feels something, you notice the sensation. So something very interesting becomes clear. Something within you is always aware of what is happening, and that something never appears as a thought. It does not speak. It does not react. It simply observes. This is one of the most important discoveries in the awakening journey, because when you begin recognizing this presence, something fundamental shifts in the way you relate to the mind. Before, thoughts seemed to control your experience. Now they begin to appear simply as events happening within awareness. They still arise, but you are no longer completely trapped inside them. Imagine that for your entire life you believed you were inside a movie. Every thought was a scene. Every emotion was part of the storyline, and you were completely absorbed in the narrative. Now something different begins to happen. You begin to notice that there is a screen where the movie is being projected. Thoughts are the images, but the screen remains. Emotions are movements, but the screen remains. Stories appear and disappear, but the screen is still there. And then a question arises that can completely transform how you understand your own existence. If thoughts are just images moving across the screen, who is the screen? Who is the one that is always present, observing everything? This question is not merely intellectual. It points to a direct experience, an experience that does not depend on beliefs, not on philosophy, not on explanations. It only depends on attention. When attention turns toward the experience itself, something begins to reveal itself slowly. There is a silent awareness present before any thought appears. This awareness does not need effort. It does not need protection. It does not need explanation. It simply exists. And the more you begin to notice this presence, the more something inside you begins to relax. Because many of the tensions in life were created by constant identification with the mind. Thoughts said something was wrong. Thoughts said you needed to fix something. Thoughts created scenarios about the future. But when you observe those thoughts from outside, they begin to lose their urgency. They become simply movements within the mind, and this creates something extremely rare in modern human experience. Inner space, a space where you do not need to react immediately to every thought, a space where you can simply be present. But this space also introduces a new kind of question, because when the mind is no longer the center of identity, something very deep begins to be questioned. If I am not my thoughts, if I am not my stories, if I am not the narratives the mind creates, then what exactly am I? This question opens the door to a much deeper investigation, an investigation that does not search for conceptual answers, but for a direct recognition of awareness itself. And when this investigation begins, something even more surprising starts to appear, something that completely transforms how you perceive reality. But to understand this, we need to look at something that usually goes completely unnoticed, something so close that it is rarely seen, something that is present right now, as you listen to these words, and that is exactly what we will explore next. There is a moment in the journey of consciousness that can feel almost paradoxical. The more you observe your thoughts, the less they seem to define who you are, yet at the same time, they continue appearing. The mind keeps producing ideas, memories, worries, interpretations, and this naturally creates an important question within your experience. If thoughts are still appearing, what has actually changed? This is an extremely important question because many people believe awakening means completely stopping the mind. They imagine a state where thoughts simply disappear, leaving only silence. But this is not the real transformation. The change is not the disappearance of the mind. The change is the relationship with it. Before, every thought seemed to carry authority. It felt like truth. It felt like a command that had to be followed. If a thought said, something is wrong, your body reacted. If a thought said, you need to fix this right now, the mind immediately moved into action. But when awareness begins to awaken, something subtle begins to happen. Thoughts still appear, but they start losing their sense of urgency. They stop feeling like absolute commands. Instead, they begin to be seen as movements within the mind. This creates a profound shift in the experience of life. Imagine that for your entire existence you believed you were inside a powerful current, a current of thoughts, each thought pulling you in a different direction. Sometimes toward the past, sometimes toward the future, sometimes toward worries, sometimes toward memories, and you were constantly carried by this current. But now something begins to change. You begin to notice that you do not have to enter the current. You can simply observe it. This shift may sound simple, but it completely changes the structure of psychological experience. Because for the first time you realize that thoughts are not mandatory. They appear, but you do not have to follow them. They arise, but you do not have to believe them. They pass, but you do not have to react automatically. This small space between thought and reaction is one of the greatest signs that awareness is becoming clearer. This space creates freedom. Freedom to choose. Freedom to observe. Freedom to remain present. But something even deeper is happening here. Because when you stop reacting automatically to thoughts, something unexpected begins to appear. Silence, not forced silence. Not silence created by trying to control the mind, but a natural silence. A silence that appears when the mind is no longer constantly fed by identification. This silence has a very different quality than simply having no thoughts. It is not empty, in fact, it feels incredibly alive. Within this silence, there is a deep sense of presence, a sense of being fully here, without the need to explain, without the need to interpret, without the need to turn every moment into a mental narrative. And as you begin to recognize this silence, something very important becomes clear. It has always been here. Even when the mind was full of thoughts, even when life felt chaotic, even when intense emotions appeared, this silence was still present, but it was hidden beneath the constant movement of the mind. Now, as attention begins to rest more deeply in awareness, this silence becomes more visible, and with it emerges something many people describe as a new way of living. A way of living where the mind still exists, but no longer dominates the experience. Thoughts remain useful. They help with planning. They help with communication. They help organize ideas. But they stop being the center of identity. They stop being the voice that defines who you are. And this profoundly changes how you move through life. Because much of the tension that existed before came from constantly believing thoughts. Thoughts saying something needed to be solved. Thoughts saying the future needed to be controlled. Thoughts creating scenarios that often never happened. Now, when you observe those thoughts, something interesting becomes visible. You start noticing how many of them are simply automatic patterns, repetitions of the past, stories the mind tells because it has always told them, and this recognition brings a quiet kind of freedom, the freedom to no longer live inside those narratives. But here's something very interesting begins to happen in the journey, because when the mind stops being the center of identity, many people begin to feel something unexpected, a sense of space, a much larger inner space than before, and within that space, something new begins to appear, clarity. But this clarity does not come from the mind, it does not come from analysis, it does not come from thoughts trying to solve everything. It arises from a much deeper place, a place directly connected to awareness itself. And as this clarity begins to emerge, a new form of intelligence starts appearing in your experience. A quiet intelligence. A guidance that does not come from repetitive thinking, a guidance that seems to arise naturally within awareness. But understanding this new form of guidance requires something important. It requires learning to trust something the mind cannot control, something that does not appear as thought, something that does not arise as a voice inside the head, yet somehow it guides life in a surprisingly precise way. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the journey of consciousness. Something many people begin to notice only after identification with a mind begins to fade. Something we call inner guidance. But to truly understand how this guidance works, we must first explore something even more fundamental. Something that completely transforms how you perceive consciousness itself. And that is exactly what we will explore next. As this new perception begins to mature within your experience, something very interesting starts to happen in the way you perceive life itself. Before, it felt like almost everything happened inside the mind. Thoughts appeared, and you reacted automatically. Emotions arose, and you believed you had to do something immediately. The mind interpreted every single situation. It created explanations. It created conclusions. It created stories about what was happening. For a long time, this felt completely natural, because everyone around you seemed to live in the same way. Modern society itself appears organized around this constant activity of the mind, planning, analyzing, judging, predicting, controlling. The mind becomes the center of human experience. But when awareness starts to become clearer, you begin noticing something very curious. A large portion of this mental activity isn't actually necessary. It happens automatically, almost like a habit, a pattern repeated so many times that it became invisible. For example, observe what happens when a small problem appears in your day. Maybe something simple, something that previously you might not even have noticed. But the mind immediately begins constructing a story. It projects scenarios, it imagines consequences, it creates concerns about the future. And often, all of this happens before the situation has even fully unfolded. It's as if the mind is constantly trying to anticipate life, trying to predict everything, trying to control every possibility. But when you begin observing this process, something extremely revealing becomes visible. Most of these mental stories never happen. The mind creates dozens of scenarios, and almost all of them just disappear. And yet, for years, these narratives consumed enormous amounts of your energy. This is the moment when many people begin to realize how much of human experience has been built upon thoughts that were never questioned. Thoughts that felt real simply because they were repeated constantly. But now, something has changed. You begin to notice these mental movements more clearly. And when this clarity appears, identification with them weakens even further. Before, a thought appeared and it immediately felt like truth. Now, when it appears, you can simply observe it. You notice the thought, but you don't need to follow it. This creates something extremely rare in human experience, a type of freedom that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Because most people believe freedom means controlling life, controlling situations, controlling the future. But there is a much deeper freedom than that, the freedom of not being controlled by the mind. When this freedom begins to emerge, something very interesting happens inside your experience. The mind begins to relax. It no longer needs to explain everything. It no longer needs to turn every moment into a story. And within this space, something very different begins to appear. Presence, a simple presence, without effort, without trying to reach something, without the constant need to interpret what is happening. You begin to notice that life is happening now, in this moment, before any thought attempts to describe it. This realization may seem simple, but it completely transforms the way reality is experienced. Because for years, the mind created the sensation that you are always slightly outside the present moment, either in the past or in the future, or trying to solve something that hadn't even happened. Now, as identification weakens, something very curious begins to appear. The present moment becomes more vivid, more clear, more real. You begin noticing details that previously went unnoticed. The sounds around you, the sensations of the body, the rhythm of your breathing, the way light touches the objects around you. Small aspects of experience that the mind previously ignored. And this reveals something very profound. Life has always been happening here, but the mind was too busy telling stories to notice it. When these stories begin losing their power, the direct experience of life becomes more visible. But this process also introduces a new phase of the journey. Because when you begin living with more presence, something interesting starts to happen. You notice that many decisions no longer need to be forced by the mind. They seem to arise naturally, as if there is a deeper intelligence guiding the experience. This intelligence doesn't function like repetitive thinking. It doesn't appear as a constant voice inside the head. It manifests in much quieter ways. Sometimes as a sense of clarity, sometimes as an immediate recognition of what needs to be done, sometimes simply as a natural movement of life. And this raises a fascinating question. If this clarity doesn't come from the mind, where does it come from? This question opens a new stage in the journey of awareness. A stage where you begin to notice that there is a form of intelligence much deeper than thought, an intelligence that has always been present, but was rarely recognized because the mind occupied all the space. Now that space begins to open, and this deeper intelligence begins to reveal itself. And when that happens, something even more surprising begins to emerge. You begin to notice that awareness is not just something inside you. It seems to be something much larger, something present throughout the entire experience. As this new perception begins to stabilize within your experience, something very quiet happens. It's not a dramatic shift, not a sudden explosion of revelation. In fact, most of the time this transformation unfolds in a very subtle way. But it changes the way you live life completely. Because when you begin to recognize that you are not your thoughts, something inside you begins to relax deeply. For many years, perhaps your entire life, the mind seemed to carry a tremendous burden. It needed to understand everything, solve everything, control everything. Every situation required an explanation. Every emotion required analysis. Every experience needed interpretation. And this created a constant sense of effort, as if living itself had to be managed by the mind. But when awareness begins to recognize that thoughts are simply movements within the mind, that weight begins to dissolve. You begin to see that life doesn't need to be controlled all the time. It can simply be lived. And this shift brings something many people describe as a new kind of lightness. A lightness that doesn't come from solving every problem in life, but from realizing that the mind doesn't have to carry the entire world on its shoulders. Because when you observe deeply, you notice something remarkable. Most of life happens without the participation of the mind. Your heart continues beating, your body continues breathing, your nervous system continues functioning. Millions of processes unfold within your body without any effort from the mind. And in the same way, many movements of life happen naturally. Conversations appear, decisions arise, situations unfold, and when you are present, many of these responses emerge spontaneously, without the mind needing to plan every detail. This realization changes your relationship with life in a profound way. For a long time, the mind believed it needed to control everything for life to function. But when you begin to observe carefully, you realize that life is already happening. It is already moving. It is already unfolding moment after moment. And you begin to notice that you can participate in this experience in a completely different way. Not as someone trying to control everything, but as someone present within the flow of life. This presence creates something very rare, a sense of trust. Not a trust based on mental certainty, but a quiet trust in the unfolding of life itself. You begin to notice that when the mind is not constantly interfering, there is a natural intelligence guiding the movement of life. An intelligence often far clearer than the mind's attempts to control everything. And this opens a completely new way of living. A way of living that doesn't depend on the mind for every small movement. A way of living where presence becomes more important than control. But something very interesting begins to happen here. Because when you start living with more presence, your experience of reality begins to change. Situations that once seemed confusing begin to feel clearer. Decisions that once required long analysis begin to arise more naturally. Even the way you perceive the people around you begins to shift. Because when you are not completely lost in thought, you begin to experience life more directly, more real, more alive. And this shift opens the next stage of the journey of awareness. A stage where presence stops being just an occasional moment and begins to become a way of living. But understanding what it truly means to live in presence transforms the way you perceive reality itself. Because presence is not simply being in the moment. Presence changes how you see thoughts. It changes how you relate to emotions. It changes how you experience consciousness itself. And as this understanding deepens, something even more profound begins to unfold. You start to see that presence is not something you do. It is something you are. And this is exactly what we will explore in the next video. Because when you begin truly living in presence, very deep transformations begin to happen in your experience of life. Transformations many people never imagined possible. So in the next episode, we will explore something essential in this journey. What truly happens when you begin to live in presence. Because this is where awareness begins to transform the way you experience reality itself. If this journey resonates with you, continue walking with us. Watch the next video and go even deeper into this discovery. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path.